Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Efficient Derek here today. Word on the street is that these introductions have become a bit indulgent and long-winded, so we're going to get right to the point. Joining me today is Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson in our series George MacDonald for Every Generation. Kirstin is going to join me in talking about community and the environment. And no one is better equipped or more experienced in this regard on this topic than Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson is a George MacDonald scholar. She lives on a farm in the Ottawa Valley, Canada, and there she directs an organization, Windstone Farm Linlathen. It's a nonprofit that seeks to cultivate community through theology, ecology, and the arts, and they do just that. Kirstin is also very involved with an organization, A Rocha International, Christian movement founded to network and help with ecological stewardship, among other things. I'm so thankful you're here today, and I'm so thankful to Kirstin for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. Well, I am probably grinning ear to ear because one of my favorite people, one of my just most exciting new friends that I've met in the last year or so, Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson, is joining me. And we're going to talk about George MacDonald on community. But Kirstin, you're kind of in a community right now as we're recording. Where are you at and what's going on?
I am, Derek, and it's a delight to be here and here with you and part of your expanding group of friends. It's a real pleasure and gift. And I am today about 8 hours south of where I live in Ontario. I'm in a place called Guelph, Ontario, not too far from Toronto. And I am staying in a retreat center called Loyola House, which is overseen by the Jesuits and the Ignatian Jesuit Center. And it's one of the places, not just in Canada, but globally, where one can come to do the 40-day silent Ignatian spiritual retreat, which I did here 5 years ago. And I'm tucked away here again now by their grace to do a bit of writing. But it's a really beautiful community, and the spiritual exercises which invite you to dive deep into the life and story of Christ in a truly transformative way. Not something that I think MacDonald himself actually did. I don't think he did the exercises, but there is evidence in his writings that definitely some of his mentors and he himself were familiar with the concepts that Ignatius invites us to do about immersing ourselves in the story of Christ and being present to his stories. In fact, MacDonald talks us through that in The Seaboard Parish, the novel The Seaboard Parish, which was really exciting for me when I discovered that. And this here in Guelph, Ontario, at Loyola House is a place where people come to do just that.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, it sounds peaceful for sure. For those of us who have not experienced this or are unfamiliar with the practices, what would that pattern look like over the course of, I guess it would be about 6 weeks?
Yeah. You can do the exercises. There's a version that's been set up so you can do them at home. And some people are familiar with going away for a weekend Ignatian retreat. But the full immersive long retreat has a few days of interaction with other people who are doing it at the beginning and end. But during the majority of the time, the only person you speak with the entire time is your spiritual director. And you also experience a worship service together each day. But each day is framed around 5 hours of prayer focused on a particular passage in the life of Christ. And you start with the Annunciation through to the Great Commission. And your spiritual director will meet with you, assign you 1 verse, 10 verses, never very long, to read, to spend time with, and to pray through. And you spend an hour praying through the baptism of Christ and trying to be truly present to the moment, to see the space in your prayer, to be there. And then you come after an hour, you're sort of amazed at everything you've learned, like we do anytime we spend time looking closely at scripture. And you're like, I never saw that before. And wow, I never thought of that in that way. And then you realize you have to go back for another hour, not long after that. And then another hour. And then you think, surely there's nothing new within this day that I can experience or discover within this passage. And without fail, again and again, each time you do. And You're supposed to come with a question of discernment, life discernment, to walk alongside you are journeying deeper into knowing Christ and his story. And it is sufficiently transformative, perhaps predictably transformative enough that when you meet someone else who's done the exercises, it's immediate connection. It's almost
Yeah.
like you climbed Everest too. You did the exercises, the full exercises as well. And the Everest illusion reminds me when I finished my exercises 5 years ago, a friend said to me, "You must be so rested 40 days away." So, my gosh, I am so exhausted because it's exhausting to spend that much time, intentional time in prayer is beautiful, but exhausting. And they said, "Well, would you do it again?" And I said, "Well, it's like asking me, would I climb Everest again? I'm sure I would want to, but not right away. In a long time from now."
Yes. Interesting.
Yeah.
And can I ask one more follow-up question?
Yeah, for sure.
What's the transition back to the day-to-day
Day-to-day
working
life.
life from that experience?
In some ways, it's a little difficult for me to answer what the norm would be because I did my exercises 5 years ago. And we came out, no internet, no
Ah,
texting the whole time.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
here, and we came out of the exercises to discover that the world was shutting down.
Wow.
And so I went home to a quiet world, which I think, it gave me a different sort of transition.
Hmm.
I'm an introvert by nature, anyways. I enjoy being alone, so it wasn't difficult for me to carry on in quietude. So it probably looks different for different people, but you do have a day and a half engaging with the group who are doing the exercises alongside you, who you do not
Okay.
speak with, but
Hmm.
you live alongside, you eat meals alongside, which is also quite incredible how deep relationally you can go with someone with whom you are not speaking.
Hmm.
And
Fascinating.
I have a couple of very close friends who've come out of that time together, even though we rarely spoke with each other during the time we were together.
Wow. Oh my, how marvelous. Last question about Loyola and what you're up
Yeah,
to. I'm
yeah.
curious if you're allowed to share what you're writing, what you're working on.
Thank you, Derek. When I was working on my PhD on George MacDonald 20 plus years ago, a publisher very kindly said to me that he was keen to publish my thesis when I was done, but was hoping that I would be able to transition it from more academic speak to language more accessible for the everyday reader. And that was a huge privilege to be asked that at that point in time. And when I finished my PhD, life was just super, super busy and my health wasn't great. So it just kept on getting put off. And I worked on it a little bit, but I haven't really looked at it for about 10 years. Last year, as all your listeners will know, was the bicentenary of George MacDonald. And there were many conferences celebrating MacDonald and his work. And at every single conference I was at, I had people poke me, ask me, encourage me to please finish it, to not just set it aside, which I had kind of decided I probably would just set aside because so much amazing work is being done on MacDonald right now. There's so many fantastic young scholars who are addressing some mistakes of the past and pushing forward in new ways. But many of those scholars were the ones who asked me to please go ahead and move it. You can access my entire PhD online. Anybody can do that, but asked me to finish the project of writing it up into a book. So that's what I'm trying to do, but without a lot of new research or update, really just translating what is there and hoping that that will be a primer and an invitation to others to foray out into some of the new work that is being done. Because as I want to emphasize, there are some amazing, as you know, you've had some of them on your podcast, some
Yes.
wonderful new scholars, young scholars who are coming. I mean, some wonderful old scholars as well. But
Right.
I'm quite excited by the ever growing number of really good George MacDonald scholars.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is beautiful to be caught up in it for myself, mostly as a bystander and a huge advocate, getting more and more engaged. I can
Contributing.
imagine that those younger scholars, as you describe them, though you have plenty of years left, but I imagine, as for me, your work was pivotal in helping them continue on that journey. You've been such a
figure of inspiration, and you're genuinely magnetic with respect for your enthusiasm to MacDonald, and it's attracting among others. I know that you're humble and gracious, but you certainly have done your part to uphold and advance the life and the beauty and the mystery of George MacDonald's work.
Thank you, Derek. If I can encourage any number of new people to his work and to diving deep into it and getting his love for the world, for God, for everything around him, then that will bring me joy.
Good.
Yeah.
Here, here. Um, Now, we're talking about today George MacDonald specifically to community, and the reason
Hmm.
I asked you to be the voice for that in this series is you practice, I think, community very robustly, particularly in an age post-COVID, especially as we navigate that extreme isolation and try to reintegrate with one another. I sense a stirring among the younger generation for these types of participatory experiences with one another. But also, I was thinking, you're at a community right now in Southern Ontario, but you live and operate a community at Windstone Farms, and I'm curious if you tell us a little bit about Windstone, and then am I right in thinking that George MacDonald might be right at home there?
I'd love to think he would be. He maybe wouldn't be completely comfortable that there's a whole bookshelf of books written by him, dedicated to him, and a few of his quotations on the wall here and there. Maybe he'd delight. Hopefully, he would delight in that. But I do think it's a space that he would be quite comfortable in for multiple reasons. Windstone Farm is on. It's a what's called a century farm. The name's a bit of a misnomer these days because it's more like a two-century farm. It was built in the house I live in was built in 1840, old stone farmhouse. It was settled on Anishinaabe lands in about 1816 or so, and that's when people started clearing and turning it into a farmland. Right now, it is about half of that property is what's called arable, farmed land, so fields and hay fields and grain fields. And the other half, we have been rewilding for well over 15 years now. And that means helping remove some invasive species, plant some native species. An exciting part of that for the farm and the identity of the farm has been cleaning out and revivifying a stream that
Hmm.
hasn't run for over 80 years. And as we do that, watching various species come back to the stream and hearing the stream sing again on the land. And MacDonald, when you read his letters, not just his early letters, but I'm thinking particularly some of the letters of when he's writing back to his young fiance at the time and new wife at the time, when he goes back home to the land that he grew up in, he talks about how wonderful it is to hear the field birds again and the forest birds, but he especially talks about the grassland birds. He worries about whether those birds will survive the Industrial Revolution. But he also writes of getting on his horse, Missy, riding up into the hills. And he would miss that at Windstone. We don't have very big hills, but he would ride up into the hills and just enjoy creation, but also sit up there on his horse as he did as a child and read books. As a kid, he loved to lie on the back of his horse and read. I'm trying to remember some of the things that he read that he mentions reading on the back of the horse, but certainly at that time he was, Arabian Nights and Ancient Mariner. And that he could do at Windstone. He could jump on the back of one of the couple of horses there and go riding about and hear those grassland birds. And there's a large library that he could tuck into, and there are I'm going to speak Canadian here, about 16 kilometers of walking trails on the property, walking and riding
Okay.
trails on the
Yeah.
property that
About 10
connect.
miles for
That,
us
that 10
down in
miles?
the
Okay.
States. Yeah.
And connect into other neighbor properties, which I think would also be something that would resonate with MacDonald, that the land, it doesn't have high borders. There is no big wall. These lands, interpenetrate each other, and the neighbors move across those boundaries. But also with that's sort of the natural side, or the non-human side, if you will. But at the farm, we run a nonprofit from the farm called Windstone Farm Linlathen, which seeks to cultivate community through theology, ecology, and the arts. And that's sort of our focus. For me, that's kind of my sweet spot: theology, ecology, and the arts. And I think it really was for MacDonald too. I think that's something people haven't realized, how much those things all together meant to MacDonald. And I think that would delight him, the interaction of farmers old and new on the land, with poets like Malcolm Guite who come to visit, or when Trevor Hart comes to lecture, or Sharon Jebb, the integration of those people with each other, the young adults who live in the area who mix with the university students who come, the elementary students who come for poetry and nature days. We have sometimes house concerts. Lauren Wilkinson had a book launch for his Circles in the Cross book at the farm. We also have a summer conference that's focused on theology, ecology, and the arts. And this summer, the Rabbit Room folk, Jennifer Trafton and Pete Peterson, are speakers. And in the past, we've had poets like Micheál Ó Siúil and Malcolm Guite, and artsy theologians like Trevor Hart and my father, David Jeffrey, or more ecologically focused people like Norm Wurzba, musician Steve Bell, Lauren Wilkinson, Indigenous teacher Cheryl Bear. And there's many other wonderful speakers and people who come to teach and then kind of become a part of the farm. And because they become friends with my neighbors, with the farmers or other people who live around, as well as the young people who weave in and out. And if you want to see some picturs or learn more about that, you can look up Windstone, so blowing wind, a stone that makes men stumble. So Windstone Beckwith, BECKWITH.com. And if you try that, if you get the spelling slightly wrong, I'm sure Google will help you out.
I'll put the link in the description of the show.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Derek. And so we just try to facilitate community, model community, and I think that's where MacDonald I think that's something that he and his entire family, it wasn't just MacDonald, it was Louisa and the children who all participated in this, who drew in others and who drew in a real mix of people. This was central to MacDonald, that he was pulling in, and I think you've probably heard me use this line before, priests and princesses, poets and politicians and impoverished people, paupers and super rich people at the same time, in the same gathering, to play together, to feast together, to watch theater together, to do story together. And I know that he was influenced by a number of different mentors in doing this. A.J. Scott modeled this himself. A.J. Scott and his wife Anne modeled this in London, MacDonald's mentor, but then they were both influenced by Thomas Erskine of Linlathen. And actually the summer conference at our farm is called Linlathen, after Erskine's work, in Windstone Farm Linlathen, and in homage to Erskine's choice to create a space where people of different perspectives, different theological perspectives or none, different cultures, different classes, could come together and play music, read books, eat together, and feel safe in conversation. I think they were all three of those men that I've named, and their families, I want to emphasize that, their wives and their families, were masters of hospitality. Not just in praxis with their home, their physical space, but in their conversation, in their being. And in fact, Thomas Carlyle, who's quite a thorny guy, and pretty vocal with his problems with Christians in his day and age. There's a beautiful letter, there's several letters where he talks about this, but there's a beautiful letter where he writes, I believe it's when he's writing his wife Jane, and he's talking about Thomas Erskine and A.J. Scott, MacDonald's mentors, and saying, you wouldn't believe these people. They're actually the best of he says something like, they're Christians, but this type of Christian is the best of the best. And I feel welcome And he was kind of shocked at how much they loved him. And in fact, they even helped him edit some of his manuscripts. But even though he knew that they didn't agree with him on many ideas, he loved going to their place. In one letter, Jane says, you need to go up and spend time at Linlathen. Just like later, Louisa says to George MacDonald at one point in time when he's tired, do go to Linlathen, a place of respite, but also of diverse community where people felt safe to be themselves, whoever they were and wherever they were in the journey. And that's something that we seek to emulate and want to do ourselves at Windstone Farm and with the various events that we have at the farm. And I think is really true to the spirit of MacDonald. I think that's one of the reasons he's so unique in his day and age, and one of the reasons he influences so many different people. Whether Florence Nightingale transcribing MacDonald's novels to take to the field with her.
Amazing.
Or various artists, Ellen Terry, or I'm trying to think, some of the names are going to elude me at the moment, but whether they're theater people or various priests or, novelists, such a wide group of people who didn't agree with him on all things theological, didn't agree with him on all things political for sure, but knew that he loved them and that they could be who they truly were in his presence. It's so important to MacDonald. And I really hope is something that those of us who work with him and on him will seek to foster, especially in a day and age when we are so polarized and do not have many models of unity and diversity. Yeah.
That's so true. Thank you, Kirstin. One thing you mentioned, and maybe community starts with our ecology in part, right? But the rewilding, I was at a conference 6 years ago or so and came across Isabella Tree.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Yes, that's her name, Isabella Tree, Rewilding,
Yes.
which is just published last year, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah, remarkable vision, and the work that they're doing in England, I believe, is astounding.
It is.
Yeah.
And I've heard there's a documentary of their work as well. I've not seen the documentary, but I have read the work. And
Can
yeah. I've not seen the documentary, but I've heard that it's good. I have read the book and have had a chance to engage with some other people who've met Isabella Tree. They're doing really fascinating work. And I think MacDonald would be so intrigued, not least because he, particularly in the novel What's Mine's Mine, really addresses exactly. In fact, as I was reading Rewilding, I was wanting Isabella Tree to be reading What's Mine's Mine so much, not least because she quotes passages from Isaiah. In some of her epigraphs, which is a key text to What's Mine's Mine, which is MacDonald's novel that's set in the north of Scotland, an area that's called Sutherlandshire, or also Mackay's land, Mackay's country. And MacDonald's mother was a Mackay, so it's the area that his family's from, and he weaves in a bunch of his family's history. But it's set at a time of the clearances of Scotland. And I'm always surprised at how many people are not familiar with the clearances.
I'm not.
No, my part of Canada, it was part of the school curriculum. I'm particularly shocked by all my English friends who've never heard of the clearances, because the clearances are what populated much of New Zealand, Canada, and certain portions of the States in particular, because they are when the poor Scots were cleared off their lands by the wealthy landowners in Scotland, often English landowners, not only English landowners, but cleared off the land so that the landowners could bring in sheep for food, but also deer for hunting. And it was a more economic decision for them to move the people away from their ancestral homes and bring in hunting and farm animals in larger flocks, which was devastating for the land itself. And MacDonald discusses that in What's Mine's Mine. In fact, MacDonald accurately predicts the extermination, what we call the extirpation, which is a local extinction of a species. He predicts correctly the extirpation of several species in his novel. And I'm happy to say species that now have been reintroduced to Scotland and are doing fine. But MacDonald saw, because the clearances were still happening. They're at their height in the late 1700s and early 1800s, but they were still happening during MacDonald's lifetime. So one more example of his political voice, his social activist voice, and his showing how clearing people off the land is devastating for the people, for their language, for their story, their sense of self, on so many levels, devastating for the humans, but also devastating for the land itself and the other creatures who have lived on that land with those humans for, you know, time immemorial. And MacDonald addresses a bunch of the social justice issues around that, but also shows how it shows what happens to the land, how the land starts to be killed. And in part because the land is, at that time especially, it's not just, perhaps part of the reason that economic injustice is not impeded as much as it should be, is the land has been romanticized during the Romantic era. People see it as something that you go and visit, you see on a postcard, this beautiful, sublime, foreign thing out there that we look at. And MacDonald is pushing back against that and saying, no, it's actually something we know. People live here and they're not noble savages. They're actually real humans. And their identity and way of being and their faith is intricately intertwined with the curvature of the land, the rivers, the rocks, the natural native species here. And if you tear those things apart, then there's going to be deep long-term damage. And that's exactly what Isabella Tree and her husband, on the name of the property, I'm blanking on it for a moment, in Devonshire. I don't know if do you remember the name of the property in
It
Devon?
escapes me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so down in Devonshire, so it's one syllable. I'm trying to find it. But that is what they are trying to redress on their property. And it's a very long process, and there's all sorts of complicated issues because you can't go back to what was, nor
Right.
necessarily should you.
Right.
So what does it mean to move forward in a way in which we as humans are taking seriously our call to steward? And this again is very important to MacDonald throughout his work. I think it's more explicit in pieces like What's Mine's Mine, but it's there throughout his work. What does it mean to recognize that we are fellow creations of the Lord, that we are also creatures, and that we are called to steward the other creatures? But what does it look like to do so in a way that isn't our lording over them, but rather helping give them voice, helping them to be fully who God created them to be, to work alongside them, to use the unique skills and gifts we have as humans and our unique position as humans to help them be what God has created to be, to move away the impediments, to right some of the wrongs that we have put in the way as humans, so that all creation can sing and all creation can be fully who we were called to be when God so loved the world, so loved the cosmos, not just humans, but so loved the cosmos that he sent Christ. So what does that look like? And I think people like Isabella Tree and her husband are trying to find their way forward into that. And it's not easy.
No, no. And yet, there they are beginning, right? And I think of so many things in history where those few pioneers began what happened over generations to be transformative change. So,
And hopeful change.
yes,
Yeah. And
exactly.
you get that in the book, right? The delight that mistakes are made. Some things, issues aren't clear. Should beavers be introduced or not? And how so? Like those are complicated. I live on a farm in a wetlands. Those are such complicated, real questions. And mistakes will be made. And that's part of it. And sacrifices will be made. But her delight and joy as species return, as would, MacDonald if he heard the caper caleys singing loudly again and the corncrakes singing loudly again in the fields around his home.
Beautiful. There's something to MacDonald where there's such a resonance in my life, and yet my existence is so different. So modern. I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to what the sort of defining characteristics or hallmarks of community would be. How would one, and not that in these things are not like a checklist. That's one of the things that I strive against in our modern,
Yeah. Yeah.
produce, perform. But I'm just curious as to what are the signs of life that let someone know this is real community.
Maybe I'll start my response with a bit of a story that I was privileged to grow up in a rural community where the closest neighbors were about half a mile away. I'll try to speak American here, about half a mile away were our closest neighbors. And it was a tight, beautiful community because, and I learned this growing up, because we needed each other. We didn't choose each other. We were rooted in place, in space. And although there were electricians and farmers and doctors and there's a really wide variety of people of different faiths and denominations and none, but we knew that we wouldn't survive a snowstorm or a fire or a flood if we didn't have each other. That if a big storm was coming and the hay was on the field, we knew that regardless of whether somebody was of this political party or that political party, that made no difference at all. We were there helping each other roll the bales and get them in the barn ASAP. And we also, I really learned well because my mom was a single mom at that point in time, that accepting help from people also built community, that we needed help. And because my mother was able to accept the help from others, that also tied us together even more deeply. And
Yeah.
I have the true privilege today, back in the Ottawa Valley, to live again in a neighborhood like that. I've lived in many places in between, but in a neighborhood where we are very diverse. We're not next door to each other, as you would be in the city. We're next door to
Yes.
each other with fields in between. But we have dishes stuck in each other's houses. Like, we lose track of what belongs to who. And I think what I'm describing is what I think is an integral to healthy community, and that is that it's not cherry picked. It's who God puts around you, and learning to love who is next door. And I think that's something we did see during the pandemic. I certainly heard a lot of from my friends who lived in towns and cities who said, I actually have lived on this street for 8 years, and I had no idea what the names were of the people next to me. I'd recognize them, but I didn't even know their names, let alone know them. And all of a sudden I'm waving at them through the windows, and we're like holding up signs to each other. And that was one positive element in some communities of the pandemic, is people started to get to know the people they lived around. Instead of choosing who you hang out with, accepting who you've been placed amongst and living within that. And I think in that sense, community is this funny mix of not choice and choice, not choosing the individuals who are in your space, but choosing to be in relationship with those individuals, no matter how different you are, choosing to love them. And so within that, I think community it's not cherry picking. It requires sacrifice. It requires giving up of your own time or space or your own preferences or your own comfortabilities for healthy community. It requires, I think, true diversity. It requires gathering together with those who think differently than you, at least in some capacities. And I think those are all things that for MacDonald were very important, and we see modeled in his life. It's covenantal, if you will, rather than contractual.
Great word.
Yeah. And I think covenant is combined with sacrifice, right? People are going to mess up. And that's a sacrifice to live with that. and to
Right.
choose to keep on loving, to choose to be in covenant with the other, as opposed to, you messed up, sorry, I'm not speaking to you again. I don't like what you did to my lawn, I'm not speaking to you again. I mean, community demands of us to live differently, even
Yeah.
if it requires sacrifice
Yeah.
on our part. And that's what makes beautiful and healthy community. And I'm not ancient, but from the space of 55 years, I can say that I have seen that again and again and again. People surprised that they've actually come to love and care for these people who are so different from
Yes.
themselves. And
Right.
that's what makes us that's what makes healthy community, and for fends against the ills of prejudice and negatively othering others and turning inward. Augustine's definition of sin is turning inward on oneself. And I
Hmm.
think we do that as community, as quote unquote communities, as groups of people. We turn in on ourselves and all become the same, instead of turning out towards the other and engaging with the other, which is hard, which is risky, but is so beautiful. And I've seen so much good come from that.
I love that you use the word covenant, first of all, because those who are Christians and those who are not would at least have a familiarity with the difference between a covenant and a contract. The other thing that stands out to me is you use the word sacrifice. And I find in my own life, I'm sure this is not a revelation for anyone, but the degree to which something impedes upon my plans, my space, myself, the degree to which it's perceived as a sacrifice is directly correlated to the degree to which I have love for the person impeding me, right?
So
And
true.
when you think about children, you think about very tight, close relationships that are deep, loving, committed ones. To an outside observer,
Hmm.
a person's efforts might be seen as just extraordinarily sacrificial.
Yeah.
And the person doing them, because of the love, doesn't even perceive it. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
they might get tired, etc., but there's never where at least that's my perception.
No, our grace becomes so much more expansive.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. This, and so it goes back to MacDonald, as you say, that immense love that he was so imbued with, that just radiated, and that is the essence of that hospitality that you're talking about, I assume.
And naming, I think, is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, whether that's a butterfly or
Mm-hmm.
a tree or a human, the same holds true. It's more complicated with humans because they require more sacrifice of us. But if somebody trips you on the street, on the sidewalk as you're walking down, and they're just a random stranger, that can be, you could be very irritated. If you know the name of the person who trips you, that changes what's
Mm-hmm.
happened. If
Mm-hmm.
you know the story, which you won't get to know until you know the name of the person,
Right.
but if you know that maybe this person, has an arthritic condition in which they can't control how their legs work, then you respond completely differently, right? Or you
Right.
know that their mothers just died, and that they're not so good at navigating surroundings right now. The way you engage is so different. And all of those things may have been true of the stranger, or may have been true of the person that you only sort of know their name, but you haven't started to get to know them. And so relationship radically, and that's that grace can
Mm-hmm.
only, comes, not can only come, but it gets deeper and bigger and better the more the more truly we know someone, which again comes back to sacrifice, because being in relationship with people isn't easy. It's risky, it's difficult, it's complicated,
Yeah,
but it's deeply good.
that's right. And deeply the essence of it all at the end of the day. Um, I'm curious if you would speak to any MacDonald novels that really demonstrate community, and I'm sure they're pervasive, but that are really sort of stand out to you.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm grinning because I think it's impossible to find a MacDonald novel that doesn't address community because it's so important to him. At one point in time, in several places he talks about the concept of schism and how that he is
Yes.
just so driven to fight schism. And his son Ronald also says that the the seeking to facilitate unity and diversity and to draw people back into relationship with each other is his primary drive. And so it's everywhere. What's Mine's Mine, the novel that I mentioned earlier, which is C.S. Lewis's favorite of the realistic novels, and I think it's delightful, and it's one of the two Scottish novels that take place in Scotland that actually has no Scots dialect in it. So very easy for anybody to read, regardless of what edition you have. But I think that novel deeply explores what does it mean to be in community, to be a community. As MacDonald explores that, as I've iterated already, in terms of not just humans, but the land and all of creation on the land. And he's interweaves that with those concepts from the book of Isaiah throughout the text. I think one of the striking differences between Phantastes and Lilith, that, those bookend texts of MacDonald that are in so many ways resonant with each other. I think MacDonald dives more deeply into concepts of relationship and community in Lilith than he does in Phantastes. He hints at these things, but in Lilith, we start out with this young scholar who's really comfortable in the life of the mind. He's very happy in his library reading books, but actually going out into the problematic world of humans and living out what he's learning in the books is really tough for him. And at one point in time, he says that, I realized I much prefer my mare, my horse, and my books to actual humans. And he has to come to the place where he realizes that every human is more important than any book. And that's a huge shift for him. And it's really hard for me. And those of us who love the life of the mind get that. It
Sure.
can be a lot easier not to have to engage with humans. And that concept that happens, that Vane has to come to understanding about in the Book of Lilith, that shows up also in the Seaboard. I believe that's the novel where we have the scholar who's a Dante scholar, who, again, the big irony is that he'd rather sit in his library and read Dante than go out and engage with people. The irony, it being that the whole Commedia is about the fact that is what sin is withdrawing deeper and deeper
Right.
out of community.
Right.
And that's where Satan is in total isolation, and actually, up into Paradiso and getting closer and closer to God is ever more fully and truly in communion, and eventually full communion with others. And so that a Dante scholar does not engage with people is not just ironic, but almost sin. Like it's a beautiful picture, tragic picture of sin.
Yes.
That MacDonald is painting for us there. Love the community that is shown both of people and text in Adela Cathcart, one of MacDonald's earliest novels, in which he pulls together a bunch of short stories. And in that story, the novel begins with a young woman, Adela, who is ailing with what today we would probably identify as a deep depression, a sort of ennui. She has no desire to live. And her actual physical health it's so extreme that her physical health is failing. A community of people who love her, who care for her, come together around her, and with the suggestion of a couple key characters in this story, suggests that why don't we tell her stories and see if that can elicit interest in life and living again. And MacDonald sneaks into this novel a bunch of his short stories that different characters tell. But it's not merely a carriage for those stories. It's not just like, oh, here, this is a great way of getting my stories published that wouldn't be published otherwise. These stories are intrinsic to the plot and are repeatedly showing the importance of being in relationship and An example of one of those stories that many of your listeners will know is The Light Princess. That's where the story The Light Princess was first published. And The Light Princess is a story about someone who refuses to be in relationship, right? The princess in the story is not interested in being in relationship with other people because that requires sacrifice and gravitas. And so it's not until she can get to that space and discover how uncomfortable relationship is and the sacrifice that relationship takes and the tears that it costs that she is freed from her curse. And that's an example of one of the stories of many that happen within that tale that help this young woman, Adela, start to become more interested in life, start to learn through stories, start to engage in relationship with the tellers, both with the characters within the story, but the tellers of the stories as well. And when I say literarily, one of the important things MacDonald's doing in that story is he's also showing us it's not just fantasy stories that do this. It's not just realistic stories that do this. It's not just actual true life stories, because he has a true life story that happened to him and his wife that is told in there. It's not just poetry. It's not just song. All of these mediums have the potential to transform lives. And when we have all the mediums working together, even more powerful. And he shows throughout how these stories are also stories that engage with the stories of the past. And within that as well comes a relational power. They're informed by the gospel, they're informed by the books of the Bible, but they're also informed by the voices that have engaged with those texts through time, be that Dante or Shakespeare or Chaucer or Wordsworth or Coleridge or Tennyson. And so MacDonald's showing us many different types of relationship, many different types of community, and how in coming together and weaving together, they bring health and hope.
Beautiful. And one of the things you referenced, and well, there's so much. First of all, Ron Dart has told me repeatedly I need to read Adela Cathcart, so I still haven't gotten to it.
Ron's so right.
It's a good well, that's
beautiful.
very common. Ron
and
is often
just
right.
because your brain works this way, I think you would enjoy this. Maybe even before you read Adela Cathcart, there's a not very long book by Philip Sidney, the Renaissance writer Philip Sidney,
Yes.
The Defense of Poesy or The Defense of Poetry. The title is translated or iterated in a couple different ways.
Okay.
Read that first.
Okay.
And
Thank
then delight in how MacDonald is engaging with what Sidney was trying to teach us back in the Renaissance times.
Perfect. I have made a note,
Cool.
and Sydney came up often in my conversation earlier with Brett
With
Vandenbrink,
Brett.
of
Brett,
course.
my favorite Sydney scholar, Brett.
Yes.
Excellent.
He is an astonishing young man. There is no two ways about it. And I was privileged to speak with him for this series and look forward to watching him continue to flourish and dazzle us.
Too. I can't wait to hear that. And it is a boon to all of us MacDonald scholars that Brett is bringing his Sydney eye to MacDonald, because I'm sure, as Brett told you, Sydney is one of MacDonald's primary mentors. If you're going to list his literary mentors, Sydney is one of the top. And Sydney's the same way that C.S. Lewis published his anthology of MacDonald. MacDonald published an anthology of Sydney. He hoped to do one of Herbert, and he didn't get there. Herbert and Milton, he didn't get there. But the one that he did do is Sydney, which should right there say to you how important is. But Sydney works his way through all of MacDonald's writing. Yeah.
Well, and that's my other point with the way in which MacDonald and others interact with previous generations of writers speaks to the community, or the community within the cloud of witnesses, to use a biblical term.
Yeah.
And I've often admired Orthodox churches with the ornate paintings in the ceiling. I can't even recall what the dome is called, but in which every liturgy you're reminded that the cloud of witnesses is that close. Anyway.
Yeah, and I can't remember if we've spoken about this before or not, so stop me if we have in the past, Derek. But MacDonald is acutely aware of this cloud of witnesses as part of the community in which we partake, and that shapes and drives how he writes what he writes, and
Hmm.
engaging with the voices of the past. But he many times in his texts, be they sermons, essays, or stories, talks about the friendship that we can have with these writers,
Hmm.
and that we actually can have a relationship of sorts. And he's quick to say, the friendship isn't the same as, say, you and I sitting and having ice cream with Shelley, Amanda, and Brenton. It's not that sort of friendship, but it is a friendship, and that we can have conversation with them and dive deeper into their works to figure out the responses to some of our questions that we have of them. But also, and he gets this from Erskine and Scott and F.D. Morris, all remind us as literature scholars, as literature teachers, they taught MacDonald, and MacDonald likewise reminds us that if we do believe that life does not end when we
Hmm.
die, that we will yet sit down with Herbert, with Milton, with Chaucer, with the author of Beowulf, and discuss their works and carry on that relationship with them. And so there's this ongoing community, and that really, like many Orthodox people are privileged to have, expands your understanding of community, expands your understanding of how we are walking through this story, this chapter of our lives, that we are part of this great, as Sam says to Frodo, we're part of a larger story still, Mr. Frodo. We're in the same story still. We're part of this same
Hmm.
big this same big tome, beautiful tome.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
it
Tell that
changes things,
story.
doesn't it?
It does, and
Like,
I of course am
yeah.
instantly transported to the conversation with Sam and Frodo and tell the story again, right?
Hmm.
Anyway, um, so one of the great joys of my recent days is in December of 24, who were so gracious to permit me to join the gathering in Connecticut for the Genius of George MacDonald conference. And not only did we share copious amounts of ice cream,
Many different flavors.
of course, everyone who knows me knows that I bring desserts in abundance.
It was beautiful.
But prior to that, there was a concert performance. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it to the uninitiated because it's not typical in, we think of going to a play or going to a concert, and this was a wedding of both in my estimation. And it was Fantastes with Malcolm Guite and an extraordinary pianist whose name escapes me. I'm sure
Yeah.
you'll be able to tell me.
Benjamin
Ben.
Harding.
Yes.
Yeah. And Eric Padziadoras was the composer of much of the music that we heard.
Yeah.
And what I
And
am going to forget, which I hate, is the name of the soloist who was phenomenal. So look her
yes.
up, people, the young soloist who just graduated from Yale. And
Uh,
she was phenomenal.
yes, we will add her in to this before it is published. But it was so moving. It was worship, truly. And I'm curious how the arts help bolster community and, of course, the MacDonald family's incorporation of arts in their place and time.
How does the arts bolster community? And this is where I hope at some point in time you get Shelley Stearns on to talk about this particularly, because that whole concert was designed and facilitated and enabled because of the work of the theologian and art scholar Shelley Stearns. And she made magic. She made magic
Yes,
happen, but
yes.
not without a lot of hard work on her part. Is really, really phenomenal. As did she and Amanda Vernon together for the Wheaton Conference.
Hmm.
We also had a fantastic conference there. And how can I forget Jack Redman's piece of music that Benjamin Harding played? And that, just as we're diving into this, at some point in time, the whole Yale concert, I think, will be available for people to hear, I hope.
Wonderful.
But you can, on YouTube, very quickly Google Jack, that's Jac, Jack Redford's Fantastes piano piece, which is just stunning, just a stunning piece of music. Um, as MacDonald would say, we are created in the image of an imaginative creator. And although there are too many people who are quick to say, oh, I'm not creative, we all are created by a creator. And, I won't dive into that we all can create in some ways as much as I will. We all have the capacity to appreciate the diversity of expressions of God's goodness and beauty and truth. And I think in that, thinking that way sort of lays out that I think it's fair to say that as Christians, we don't really have an option to not heed, pay attention to, try to attend to the arts. Maybe not all arts speak a language that we find easy to access. And I use the word language advisedly because I've realized in my own journey that sometimes it is learning a new language. Now, if you were to speak Japanese or a facsimile of Japanese to me right now, I wouldn't even be able to tell which was gobbledygook and which was actual Japanese because I do not know the language. But as both may sound like gobbledygook to me, but the one is not. The one is a beautiful, ancient, old, developed language. And I've learned that with art. I've learned that with abstract art, which was foreign to me growing up, and learning that actually the reason it looked like gobbledygook to me was I didn't know the language. And learning the language has really changed my apprehension of that art form and my appreciation of that art form. And so hence my use of the word language. But I think if we do believe that we are made in the image of a God who loves diversity, who has created so many beautiful things in so many different languages, it is beholden unto us to try to get to know different aspects of expression of his goodness and beauty, whether that's being able to sit and watch a frog or a dragonfly or listen to a cardinal, or, and I don't want to say or, and to sit down in front of a piece of visual art that explores some aspect of the world he's created, the people he's created, or one of his stories that we know intimately, or read a book or listen to a piece of music. And I think the more we dive into that diversity and in different ways, the deeper our own understanding of who God is and how he expresses himself and how his creation expresses itself. I think the more wise we will grow in that, and the more full we will become, and the more able we will be the more able we will be to commune better, to relate better with others. And I don't know anyone who hasn't chosen to try to spend more time with the arts or engage with the arts more, who feels like they are, I don't know anyone who doesn't think they aren't more rich for that, who also don't think that they're a better person, engage better at relating with others. And so I think that's just like an off the top of the head argumentation of why we need to step out into the arts if they are new to us or uncomfortable for us. But they are different expressions of the beauty of the world. And MacDonald saw that, knew that, recognized that there were different languages of people who are wired differently. And so he was constantly trying to help people hear different voices and come together, and did so in ways that made people uncomfortable. In his day and age, actors, being an actor was not something that people in polite society did. And again, there are so many stories that could be told that we don't have time to tell today, but I hope you spend some time diving into MacDonald and theater and his subversive way of sort of making people uncomfortable, but reintroducing people to theater. And really, he changed the scene of theater in the proper world of England by how he engaged with the stage and how he participated in the stage. But he himself and his whole family not only did theater, many of the kids were painters. Most of the kids were musicians. They sang in the Bach choir in the Crystal Palace. Louisa played organ, not just for her Anglican church, for the Anglican church that they went to, but she also played organ for the Catholic church that they did not go to, but were friends with and in community with. When they put on theater, we talked before about the mixed people who would come to their gatherings, but say, in Italy as well, they would put on theater and invite people to see art and listen to music from the poor Italian community around them, not just the bourgeois English community around them. And because of that, again, people became friends who would have never become friends with each other or saw each other in a way that they never would have before. And MacDonald, again, could go on and on this topic, and I think you should have Shelley and others on this topic, but I'll just wind down to a beautiful place to see, a beautiful novel to see MacDonald's exploration of some of this. Well, I'll say to elect lady, not elect lady, that's not what I meant to say, The Vicar's Daughter, which is in the Marshmallow trilogy, The Vicar's Daughter, and also Guild Court, which are the two of the novels in which has a character who echoes Octavia Hill, the social justice activist Octavia Hill, but he has in those stories something that he and his family and his kids actually did and practiced them themselves. He has characters go out into the really rough, dangerous, truly dangerous housing complexes in inner London and act out plays, read stories, play classical music, play folk music with the people who were, barely making it day to day as far as eating or, dressing themselves, like people who were really struggling to survive. And one of the ways that the MacDonald family, alongside Octavia Hill, chose to minister to and to feed these people was to take art into their midst and allow healing to happen. And MacDonald in these books talks about the healing that happens. I mean, he's talking about music therapy and visual art therapy in the text. He's talking about how healing can happen through listening to music.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, thank you, Kirstin. And I will reach out to Shelley, and she's not far away from me.
No, she isn't. Yeah.
So, and while I tracked down our singer soprano
Wonderful.
from the night, Juliet Ariadne Papadopoulos.
Excellent.
So hopefully I pronounced that correctly, but Juliet's voice was angelic.
I watched
so,
the composer have tears in his eyes.
Yeah, it was
as his pieces were performed.
Well, I do indeed hope that can be available for the public at some point. Just a couple more questions. Since you mentioned healing, the great physician Jesus, any thoughts on his demonstration, embodiment of community that we can glean from?
It struck me just a couple of years ago in a Bible study with a bunch of my local neighbors. That for the first time, I think it really struck me that when Jesus calls the 12 disciples, these 12 men who are so different from each other, right? There's a couple of, there's brothers, there's a tax collector and fishermen and people with different levels of education, different personalities, that it really struck me deeply that all of these guys come from an area that is smaller than the township I live in. It's just a small community that he draws these people from. And they're people who, because the community is so small, all probably knew people who knew each other, right? Like, it's that small of a community that they would know each other's cousins or aunts or something, and also know all the baggage and crap about each other and different ways that they'd messed up, their bad reputations, whatever. Jesus didn't go like, okay, we're going to get somebody from Jerusalem and we're going to get somebody from Cana, which is what we would probably do today, right? Let's go cherry pick. And Christ doesn't cherry pick.
Let's have auditions, right?
Exactly. And I think that was one part of Christ's community action that really struck me of late. But then these people who are so different, who don't always we see is painted for us. They do not always get along, right? But
Mm-hmm.
these are the people who he has chosen to be together, to live together, to eat together. Eat, I don't think as Christians, I don't think we get how important, often we don't get how important it is to eat together. That changes. There's a reason that the Eucharist, that communion is a meal. There's something wired into how humans are created to be,
Mm-hmm.
that eating with each other changes us somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And these are men who are so different, who eat together regularly, even when they're arguing, who walk together and act the Shema. They tell the stories of the Bible while they walk on the paths. They listen to Christ's teaching as they walk, as they lay about at their meals together. And I think Christ is modeling for us in that community that he's pulled together, that is awkward and complicated and different, what can happen, and then what can grow out of the goodnesses that can grow out of an awkward community. Because that's, I think, what healthy community is. Sometimes it's very awkward. And, again, like in the parables he tells, in his answers to questions about what is important, faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is love, not faith. The greatest of these is not faith.
That's right.
Christians, hear this. Christ has told us the greatest of these is not faith. It is love. And that is key to community. And I think, again, Christ says, and he shows that again and again and again, that we bring others in, that we engage with those. We engage with our community. The disciples, he's bringing them into communion, into eating together and spending time together with prostitutes, with heretics, with awkward and complicated people. And he's pulling this community into engagement with those, modeling and asking them to accept these people who are so different, who are
Mm-hmm.
so uncomfortable, to be in communion with them. And that, I think, is what Christ, as much as anything, shows, but also speaks about community.
Yeah. Beautiful. Do you have any thoughts for the rising generation as they seek to shape and create community?
I think a young friend comes to mind immediately when you ask that question, and someone who spent time at my farm, where we have the novel nights by candlelight, where we all get together and read a Narnia book or a George MacDonald story, or games nights or work days together. And she had spent some time at the farm and was planning to go back to Korea, where she teaches English. And she said to me, it's so frustrating because I really miss community like this. And there just is not amongst my, I don't know, and none of the teachers at my ESL school want to get together. Nobody ever does things like this. And I wish we had community there, like I find at Windstone. And I said, but it won't happen till you invite somebody. And you can do that. And I think I come across so many young people who have not had hospitality modeled very well. And they see dollar signs, they see inconvenience. And so to this young friend, I said, it doesn't matter that you can't afford to feed people. Just ask everybody to bring something. Do a potluck. People actually like to help out. So instead of waiting for somebody to invite you, right, you do this. You invite others for a potluck and play games. And I'm happy to say that she did that, and it radically changed her entire school. The staff relationships because of that. I think one of the things that is a stumbling block for a lot of younger people I know is that this bit of doing it together. And I think it's not just a younger person issue, is it? We want to be able to host our big party and be in charge, but having others help us People bring food, then I can't lay my table in the perfect way, or like I'm too tired to wash all the dishes afterwards. But I don't want to ask people to help me wash the dishes. I don't want to ask people to help me chop the food. And then when they come to the farm and realize that that's just how things go. If you're going to come for a meal, you are going to chop the food, you are going to wash the dishes. Some of us, often myself included, physically cannot. And so that's been part of my learning, is because I can't, I've had to let people help me.
Mm-hmm.
And that has helped me realize that that builds community. When people, it's, too often we trot out, is more blessed to give than receive. And yet, if we do all the giving, then we're denying others the blessing. Like, we have to also allow others to have the blessing of giving. And that's the full picture. And I think that's intrinsic to community. And probably we're so independent, we're not good at letting others help us. And I've seen that shift in people's understanding, some of the young adults at the farm, in their understanding, but also back to sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Even, what you were saying earlier about, if somebody invites you to do something or asks you to help, you commit to help somebody, that probably means that if some other great opportunity comes up, you might have to sacrifice and say no to that other opportunity. And that's part of community too. And learning the goodnesses that can come of that
Mm-hmm.
is also, I think, an important part of community that I think a lot of Gen Zers, you're Gen Zers, as you guys are saying, we say Gen Z in Canada, struggle with that aspect of commitment and the sacrifice that commitment involves. But out of that can come beauty. Discomfort can come out of it, but beauty can come out of it too. Just being willing to recognize that getting together with people who aren't the same as you always, and letting each other help each other,
Mm-hmm.
and not striving for perfection, but just striving for togetherness.
Mm-hmm.
That makes for beautiful community. And I've seen awakenings happen because of that. And people fall in love with each other, but with that way of doing things.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts on this topic? But then I'd love to know what's on the horizon for you.
Yeah, I'm not going to pull out any profound thoughts at the moment because my brain is not good at working that way. But I think a theme that's threaded throughout, which I think is so important to remember and hear, is that relationship, community involves sacrifice, but sacrifice is at the foundation of our faith, right? Of all that is good. And that so many beautiful, transformative things come out of sacrifice. And community transforms because of sacrifice. And it's not easy. It's good. It's beautiful. It's not easy. And I think we keep on learning that, in our 50s, in our 60s, we keep learning different aspects of that. And how to be wise in community, how to draw boundaries, how to have permeable boundaries and not walls, but how to draw those boundaries. And, that springs to mind just because you've asked me what's ahead this next year.
Yes.
And that navigation of how far does one spread oneself and how deep does one go and when does one say no? This next year, I'm going to have fun teaching and speaking about MacDonald in a wide variety of places. I won't be traveling as much as last year, fortunately. Fortunately, the bicentenary is only once every 200 years, but I'll be in Belfast. This is not going to be in any order, but Belfast with Malcolm, the president of the George MacDonald Society, and a whole panoply of wonderful Lewis and MacDonald folk with the C.S. Lewis Foundation. In the summer, I'll be at Biola with some great friends who we met at Yale and elsewhere there. In the autumn, I will be at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford with Amanda, and a couple of Alistair McGrath and another Lewis scholar who I always feel bad when I'm blanking on names, but another Lewis scholar from the English department at Oxford in September, and then Romania in November for the C.S. Lewis Kindred Spirit Societies Conference of Eastern and Central Europe at the end of November. And so those are all really exciting. And of course, novel nights will continue at the farm with MacDonald readings. I think we're going to be doing at some point in time this year, we'll be doing The Princess, the Goblin, and the Princess and Curdie. And those
Very
are just
fun.
nights where anybody is invited in the neighborhood or further afield. Sometimes people from further afield come and we read. You know, when we did the Narnia nights, often an entire novel in a night. So we read up to no more than 4.5 hours of reading. Sometimes it's only an hour and a half, but we have intermission where people eat food that people have brought. Everybody sits around with cozy seats and beanbag chairs and blankets, and our little tagline is "Falling asleep is fine, because what's more beautiful than falling asleep to a story? If you snore, you will be poked." That's, so you're very welcome to fall asleep. Just a delight. We do those once a month at the farm. People of all
Wonderful.
ages, from 8 to 78 at least. I think we've had people in their 80s come along. Those MacDonald engagements are as important as the others. And yeah, and I have a new hat that
Yes.
I think for me is a very MacDonaldian hat. And that is, I am very honored and I'm humbled to be the rep for the Americas for A Rocha International. And A Rocha is a Christian environmental organization that has organizations around the world in over 20 countries, and sister organizations in many more. And creation care and creation education, environmental education, is a key part of what they do. And MacDonald would have been full on for the work of A Rocha. In fact, I often call What's Mine's Mine, the novel we keep on talking about, C.S. Lewis's favorite realistic novel, as the A Rocha novel of MacDonald's work of seeking to remind people that we are all part of God's creation and calling people to care for all aspects of God's creation. And that's the work that A Rocha does. And so it's a big honor to be participating with them in that capacity this year as well.
That's fantastic. Last question. Is there a significance to the name, A Rocha?
Yeah, A Rocha, the first A Rocha site was in Portugal, founded by Peter and Miranda Harris, and A Rocha is Portuguese for the rock.
Ah,
Yeah.
beautiful.
So it's a new word, capital ROCHA.
A Rocha.
A Rocha.
Well, Kirstin, once again, it's a delight to see you. I'm so grateful for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much, Derek. It is so much fun talking with you.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word convivial. 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 Perfectly suited to today's topic on generosity, hospitality, and community. As Kirstin shared with the way George MacDonald lived his life and the way she lives her own and the way we all should aspire to live. Open doors to our neighbors and friends. And the stranger, of course. Convivial, where was I? Oh yes, convivial. Convivial means friendly, lively, and enjoyable. It's summertime. Graduation season is just passed. Father's Day is around the corner. And beyond that, we have, of course, the national holiday, the 4th of July, summer picnics, just in general. A warmth brings out warmth in one another sometimes, regardless of where we find ourselves today. I hope that we'll do our part to spread conviviality. In terms of, where it comes from, traces its meaning to a Latin word convivium, which meant banquet, and tends to suggest a mood of full-bellied joviality. Who doesn't want a full belly and joviality? That crescendo moment when you've had a very filling and satisfying meal, but you're not quite in that food coma, right? You're celebrating still. You haven't gotten tired of the guest. They haven't gotten tired of you. Everyone's laughing, and that is convivial. I love convivial, and I hope you do too. There's a line Charles Dickens uses to capture the sense of convivial in his novel David Copperfield, and I'd like to read it for us today. We had a beautiful little dinner, quite an elegant dish of fish, the kidney end of a loin of veal, roasted, fried, sausage meat, a partridge, and a pudding. There was wine, and there was strong ale. Mr. Macalber was uncommonly convivial. I never saw him such good company. He made his face shine with the punch, so that it looked as if it had been varnished all over. He got cheerfully sentimental about the town and proposed success to it. Doesn't it sound great to be convivial? I don't know. I mean, I do know. That's why I'm suggesting it. Try being convivial. Have a great time. Celebrate the moments. They are so fleeting with the ones you love, and make new friends as you do. Thank you, Convivial, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.
Yeah.
Hey, Lincoln, I wonder. Hold on.
You got the book somewhere that you can show it? This beautiful cover.
No, I have an intruder.
Oh,
I think my son. I didn't quite shut the door, and my son's cat is pushing the door open.
excellent.
There we go. All right. Sorry.
No, that's totally cool.
Valentine is her name, and she's
Aw.
a tuxedo rescue, and she will just make her way around the house, of course. Anyway, so they have a documentary on rewilding, you were saying.